Charles Darwin was born on February 12th, 1809, and every year since being fellowshipped into the Unitarian Universalist ministry, I've commemorated his discovery of the evolutionary process of life changing from one form to another through natural selection, mutation, and other forces. This discovery changed the world forever. We're changed by this information. It took Western civilization out of a religious mindset that had dominated even the few non-religious thinkers up to the middle of the 19th century. There were atheists and agnostics, of course, before 1859, where their pronouncements were based upon logic, and there was little evidence to refute the common view that the Bible was truth handed down by God. Darwin's book on the origin of species refuted the claim in the book of Genesis that the earth and life on this planet were literally created in 7 days. Now, some people like to say, well, a day is different for God. Well, if it's different, then it really isn't a day. It has to be a time period that's a rotation on Earth for us. For centuries beforehand, people around the world dug up fossils, sometimes deep within the Earth, and they struggled to explain why these fossils were down so deep. Did God start creating dinosaurs and then discard the idea and bury the evidence? Would God function that way? Were these monsters created by an evil spirit? There were so many questions and no convincing answers. Darwin's theory of evolution explained that all life was derived from previous forms, and that explained the fossils. They were the remaining forms of the life that existed millions of years ago. The similar, though different, hominid bones were not persons with birth defects. They were the evidence of previous forms of life that resembled our own, and some of them were our ancestors. Darwin's theory made it possible to look at the world without the religious overlay that had been normal for previous generations. Those who believed in the literal interpretation of the human origin story in Genesis would have to defend their theological perspective or censor those who advocated for Darwinian evolution. In some ways, we are still living with this situation. Darwinian evolution is still controversial in some communities. Unitarian Universalists tend to side with Darwin, though, and have done so for a long time, with the Universalist Church of America being, if not the first religious group, one of the first religious groups in the 19th century to accept evolution in this country. I have known some persons who were Unitarian Universalists who doubted evolution as a theory, but were not swayed by a literal reading of the Bible either. Yet curiosity exists about evolution. Questions arise about our path to becoming human and our connections with other species, even ones with which we are more closely related. One of the ways to explore what it means to be human is to examine DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is a molecule that contains genetic information for the development and function of organisms. On this planet is the basic component of life. Every living thing that we have, even if it isn't connected with human evolution, has DNA. DNA tells us about previous forms of life. It even tells us who our ancestors were and where they were from thousands of years ago. Though I would no longer recommend ancestry DNA analysis, I have found that its current analysis result does finally match my family history, as I understand it from documented evidence. But DNA can even go deeper. Human beings seem very different. We come in different complexions, hair color, and shape. Eye color body shapes, and sizes. We must be genetically diverse as well, right? Not compared to our closest relatives, the chimpanzees. They seem so very similar to us. Each resembles the other physically, yet when examined genetically, chimpanzees are much more genetically diverse than we humans are. A study of chimpanzees led by the University of Oxford in 2012 found that, and I quote, surprisingly, even though all the chimpanzees lived in relatively close proximity, chimpanzees from different populations were substantially more different genetically than humans living on different continents. That is, despite the fact that the habitats of the two groups are separated only by a river. Despite humanity's apparent differences, we are unlike our chimpanzee relatives. The human species, Homo sapiens sapiens, is 99.9% identical genetically. This implies that our real differences within our species are not genetic, but are cultural. We are much more alike than species we are most closely related to. This reveals that humanity is a fairly recent species. About 50,000 to 100,000 years ago, human beings left Africa, some of them, to range through Asia and Europe. While different groups did begin to look different, the physical differences were minor, and there were issues that brought different populations together. However, it is interesting that groups of human beings separated by great oceans have less genetic diversity than chimpanzees, who actually can see each other from opposite banks of rivers in Africa. Despite these differences, we are still connected to chimpanzees through DNA. Humans and chimpanzees share about 98.8% of their DNA. This and our shared DNA with other animals. Humans share, for example, share between 80 to 90% of our DNA with most mammals. We share DNA with all the animals, even insects. So if you swat at your cousin while she's trying to extract blood from you, the mosquito, it's all right, but recognize that there is a kinship between you. If your cousin's doing that, she deserves it. The sharing of DNA points to a time of divergence between mutation, survival of the fittest, and other factors. We shared an ancestor. At one time we were the same, and then something happened and we took different paths. This is the evidence of Darwinian evolution. It is difficult to imagine what response a biblical literalist might give to the fact that humans share DNA with other species other than evolution. Perhaps the response was that the Creator had a DNA model and for efficiency's sake decided to sprinkle the same DNA when creating different species on the same day. The simpler solution is that all life is the product of evolution from one form to another or others. We are the product of millions of years of struggling to survive. We are the product of millions of years of competition. We are the product of favorable mutations. So are too all the animals on this planet. A part of you is like a dog or a cat. A part of you is in the insects buzzing around your head on a summer's night. A part of you is in the fish swimming by. This is a connection that seems absurd, but it isn't. Some of the natural forces that made us are also in the animals. We are connected. In our rise to becoming the dominant species on this planet, we tended to make the animals separate and inferior, only there for our use, as is written in Genesis. We detached from other life on this planet. because we justify doing so, as we were the only species that we thought mattered. Many religious scriptures in the world over rarely mention other creatures except for their use by us. Yes, some indigenous traditions do mention creatures as fellow travelers, but in the dominant religious cultures, and that includes non-theistic paths like humanism, until recently, the right for other animals, other than those we use to exist, was rarely mentioned. DNA and evolution tell us that we are not a separate creation, but a creation that occurred in a journey with many other animals. We have forgotten that we are tied to the rhythms of the tides, that our lives are connected to other animals, that we are not our own. We are surrounded by the miracle of life. Some Unitarian Universalists feel uncomfortable with the word miracle because of its traditional use in many religions. Yet life on this planet can only be described in its deepest terms as a miracle. All life started as a chemical soup a longer time than any of us can realistically imagine. That was a miracle. The Earth went through traumas like the Cambrian extinction and the mass extinction event 65 million years ago that ended the age of the dinosaurs. 3/4 of the animal and plant species that existed then died from the asteroid impact. Life arose from those catastrophes. That was a miracle. Sometime about 100 to 200,000 years ago, estimates vary, a genetically mutated hominid female was born in Africa. She is considered a human being, the first human being. Sometimes we call her Eve. That was a miracle. Religious naturalism tells us that the natural world can be approached with awe and wonder. We can experience this when we understand our connections to life, and that the same feelings we experience can also be found in other animals. We are not truly unique. We can experience this with the animals that are with us. We need to sing as the birds do. We are curious as many mammals are. We need to have play in our lives as many animals do. We are not completely different. Charles Darwin felt this when he penned On the Origin of Species. In so many of his writings, he diverts from purely scientific concerns to emotional amazement that life gives form to life and that life persists over time. In his time, Darwin did not have the science to explore chromosomes or the full awareness of DNA. He could not know that the building blocks of life would validate his theory. His awe and wonder at the diversity of life on Earth inspired him deeply. He found life a miracle in itself. This miracle is accessible to all of us if we can approach it. Great poets have known this wonder when they observed life, that molecules were animated. Walt Whitman was no exception in seeing the wonder of life in his poem, Song of Myself. He wrote, "I believe a leaf of grass is no less than the journey, work of the stars, and the pismire is perfectly equal, and a grain of sand, and the egg of the wren, and the tree toad is a chef-d'oeuvre for the highest, and the running blackberry would adorn the parlors of heaven, and the narrowest hinge in my hand puts to scorn all machinery, and the cow crunching with depressed head surpasses any statue, and a mouse is a miracle, enough to stagger sextillions of infidels. May we find this awe and wonder in the smallest things and realize that this is all of us and that this is life. May we live in amazement and reverence for life on this earth. May we be grateful and strong in this moment. So be it. Blessed be. Amen.